Okay, with us along for the ride today, then there can only be one man for the job, and that is the Athletics' James Horncastle. James, thank you for joining us. What a
Pleasure.
season for Serie A and the Italian sides.
Yeah, it is remarkable. I mean, if you just look at European performance, Ian, to have 5 teams in UEFA semi-finals across all of their competitions, Champions League, Europa League, and Conference League, it is remarkable. I mean, you have to go back, I think, to 1991 to have at least an Italian team in each of the 3 competitions. Back then, it was the Cup Winners' Cup rather than the Conference League. And it's brought a lot of eyeballs on the league, a lot of attention. Question is Serie A back? Is it as competitive as it was in the past?
Is this it back?
Well, on the face of it, it is, because as you mentioned,
there though, isn't there?
Well, ultimately, the gap between Serie A and the Premier League is still so vast economically that it's difficult to expect Italian teams to be able to repeat this over and over again. Okay. I mean, if you go back last year, for example, there were no Italian teams in the quarterfinals of the Champions League. So it's not like they have been building towards what we've seen this season. I think Roma winning the Conference League under Jose Mourinho, that was Roma's first trophy in 14 years. It did show teams what is possible. And I think also the dynamics of this season have contributed to what we've seen in Europe, in that Napoli were runaway leaders, even going into the World Cup break, and particularly after they beat Juventus 5-1, I think their second game back. And that, I think, led a lot of the teams to think, actually, look, the title's gone. Let's focus on cup competitions. And so that environment has certainly contributed. But in the medium term, when Premier League clubs are making 3 times more than Serie A clubs from TV revenue, when Premier League clubs are making 3 times more what Serie A clubs are from stadiums, match day revenue, it means that Serie A is still really up against it when it comes to closing that gap and being what it was in the 80s and 90s. Now, that doesn't mean it's not a compelling competition, because I think one of the things that's really fun about Serie A and is kind of the envy of other leagues or any sporting competition is you've got plurality, you've got diversity of champions, 4 different champions in 4 years. And the knock-on effects of that are that fan bases believe that their team can win something every year. So fans are coming back in their droves to stadiums, stadiums that, to be honest, aren't really fit for purpose anymore, because a lot of them were built for the 1938 World Cup. And
been
yet,
a while since then.
But yeah, exactly. And so that is great, Ian, because you're seeing these packed Colosseum-like stadiums, and that makes the TV product better. Because if you're watching TV and the stadium's only half full, and you're a casual football fan, you're like, well, if a fan of this team can't be bothered to go watch them, why should I be watching them on the sofa?
Fair,
and
yeah.
And instead, when the stadium is sold out and there are flares and there are big choreographies going on, it is infectious. It makes you want to not only watch it, but it makes you want to think, I'm going to book a ticket to go and to watch Napoli. I'm going to get a flight to Milan or something like that. So, all of that makes it sort of, on appearance, it looks like it's back. But as I mentioned, there are some pretty big systemic problems that they still need to address if they are to close that gap with the Premier League.
So the Milanese gather on Wednesday for the Derby della Madonnina as Inter and AC face off for a place in the Champions League final. I think I pronounced that right, James. I've tried that 3 times. You can definitely say it better than me. But what a semi-final this is for Italian football, and particularly for Milan.
It is. It's, again, in terms of this question of is Calcio back, you could not wish for a better showcase for the league than the Derby della Madonnina in a Champions League semi-final.
That's how you say it.
Because Yeah, this is spectacular. It's played at San Siro, which is the Scala del Calcio, which is the famous opera house in Milan where all the virtuosos play. So, whenever the national team plays a big crunch game, they play at San Siro because it's the stadium with the most grandeur. It's one of the kind of wonders of the football world, if you like. Both fan bases, whenever this derby takes place, they ensure that it is one of the world's best games to go and watch. Not only for what happens on the pitch, but what happens in the Curva Sud and the Curva Nord, because the choreographies the fans plan are breathtaking, jaw-dropping. So I can only imagine what they've got planned for these two games. We've seen this happen before in 2003. That was the last time it was a Champions League semi-final. Milan progressed on away goals. We then saw it happen in 2005 in a Champions League quarterfinal, which is the game behind that iconic photo of Materazzi leaning on Manuel Rui Costa's shoulder as the flares rained down from the Inter end, which led to the suspension of the game and Milan going through to that final, which, as a guy from Manchester, Ian, I'm sure you'll remember at the Theatre of the Dreams, fondly. one of the all-time great finals.
Yeah.
But
I remember all the balls that were suspended above the pitch. That was pretty spectacular, to be fair.
They should bring that back.
It was great.
I don't think that's ever happened before or since Champions League final. So UEFA, please take note. But
it just gave me great anxiety that the ball would hit them at some point and it would affect the game in some way.
But I think the city of Milan, I always find it funny. I remember when Nemanja Vidic, not to draw on too many Man United stories, but when Vidic was going to play for Inter, there was always this kind of like, oh, what's he going there for? If it rains all the time in Manchester, Milan's not much better, but Milan is a fantastic place to live, to watch football. I mean, in terms of history and prestige, only Madrid kind of compares because, Madrid, 14 Champions League trophies are in trophy cabinets there, but they're all with Real Madrid. Whereas in Milan, there are 10 and Milan have 7 and Inter have 3. And I think as a city, culturally, it's impacted football like no other place in Europe. You think of the 60s when I think Inter and Milan went to 5 finals, and that's when a lot of legacy clubs' legacies were defined in that era. In terms of tactics as well, the city of Milan kind of defined Italian football because that's where Catenaccio was played in the 60s and 70s, and it became the identity for the national team, and it's became what people associate Italian football with. And then AC Milan changed that in the late 80s with Arrigo Sacchi, the pressing concepts, which we see in the Premier League to this day. I remember Jurgen Klopp after a Dortmund game being interviewed on Italian TV. I think Dortmund had just played Napoli, and he saw Arrigo Sacchi in the TV studio, and he had to tell him that he was the guy who inspired him most as a manager because Wolfgang Frank, Klopp's mentor, he was the guy who bought all the VHS tapes of Arrigo Sacchi's Milan. Pep Guardiola, whenever he's in Italy, makes sure he has lunch with Arrigo Sacchi. So again, that just goes to show the influence that Milan and the city of Milan has had. And so for all this to be, again, wrapped up in a Champions League semi-final, it feels right. And so many articles that I've had to write over the last few years is whatever happened to AC Milan or whatever happened to Inter. And here they are. And they still have a way to go in terms of they've got their own issues, I suppose.
What sort of shape are they in, James, for this game?
They're in great form, to be honest, which is fantastic. I mean, Inter were outside the top 4 in Serie A and have this reputation for being a cup team, at least under Simone Inzaghi. They lost the league on the final day of last season to Milan, but they won the cup and they won the Super Cup. This year, they've won the Super Cup. They're back in the Coppa Italia final. And they're in the Champions League semi-finals for the first time since they won the treble under Jose Mourinho. And a lot of the squad players that they've had, who are really good. I mean, Mourinho has been pointing this out because it's come at Roma's expense. If Inzaghi wants, he can play Lautaro Martinez and Dzeko up front, and if he wants, he can bring on Lukaku. He can bring on a striker that they paid 35 million for called Joaquin Correa, who scored against Benfica in the quarterfinal. And Lukaku's had a difficult season. All of a sudden, is scoring and assisting, and he's combining with Lautaro Martinez. So they look very good, and certainly have had the better against AC Milan in the last two games that they played against them. But Milan, the story of their league title last year was that they were a team that kind of upgraded, modernized. I mentioned how young they were, but their coach, Stefano Pioli, kind of spent a little bit of time out of the game, studied a lot of the kind of new pressing concepts out of Germany, implemented them in Italy. And so you had this kind of team that played with the high line, which was quick at the back, which was about pressing. Champions League this year, I hadn't seen any of that. We've seen kind of old school Milan just grinding out, just sat back, defended really well. I know Steve Holland, the England assistant manager, was in Naples for Napoli Milan because Tomori was playing, and Tomori gave away a penalty in that game, but Tomori was otherwise outstanding. And so it'll be pretty interesting to see this game. A lot of people expect it to be really tight because, again, that's sort of what they associate, not just all Italian affairs, but whenever two teams from the same country play against each other, it tends to be tight.
Final we mentioned before, didn't we?
Yeah. Let's hope for something different from that.
Did anyone have a shot? I don't remember.
Yeah, I mean, there's a famous bullet header by Inzaghi, which Buffon saved. But
that's it.
But the thing is, these games have been great, Ian, recently. I mean, I remember one of the last games that I went to before the pandemic hit. It was Conte's Inter against Pioli's Milan. Pioli's Milan were 2-0 up at halftime, and they lost 4-2. And over the last couple of seasons as well, we've seen 4-3s, 3-2s, big turnarounds in second half. So if we get something like that, obviously, whoever goes out, it will eclipse anything else they've done this season. It will be awful to go out against their cousins, as they're known in Italy, and then kind of sit back and think, oh God, are they going to win the Champions League? Because I remember when Inter won the Scudetto in 2007, Milan won the Champions League, and on Milan's open top bus parade, Massimo Ambrosini held up a banner saying, "You can shove the Scudetto up your ass." So I mean, I'm sure if Milan was to go on and win the Champions League and Inter won the Coppa Italia, someone else would dust off that banner and say, "You can shove the Coppa Italia up your ass," or vice versa. So, it's going to be great. I think anyone who is unaware of Italian football, just watch that game because it's everything that's great about Italian football. If anyone's lucky enough to go, they will, and it's their first Madonnina, they will go into the San Siro and they'll come out of it a different person, because it is really something else when you get to experience a Derby della Madonnina.